She looked like the kind of girl trouble happened to, not the kind that walked straight through it. Thin, pale, shoulders rounded in a universal hunch of people who've been in a hospital too long. The paper bracelet slid loose on her wrist as she shuffled along the corridor at Naval Medical Center San Diego, one hand to her side, slippers whispering against linoleum. To the three men shadowing her, she was an easy mark, some broken thing limping away from the ward. They saw a frail woman in a faded patient gown. They didn't see the trident inked, small, and quiet on the inside of her left wrist, half hidden under tape and bruises. They didn't know that 2 years earlier, a foreign militia leader had promised the equivalent of a year's salary to whoever could bring him her head. And they had no idea that the girl they were about to corner had already outlived better killers than them. Naval Medical Center San Diego, at 2,100 hours, smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. The day shift had gone home. The night crew moved in lower gear. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making everyone look a little more ghost than human. The orthopedics corridor was empty. Nurses stationed down at the end, mostly blocked by a pillar. The TVs in the waiting room behind her were off. Visiting hours were long over. Cameras, though, they never slept. Petty Officer First Class Riley Shaw walked with the careful, measured steps of someone who'd recently learned exactly how many things in your body can hurt at once. 29 years old and, at the moment, looking closer to 40. Her left arm was immobilized in a sling. A rigid brace hugged her right knee. Purple-yellow bruises washed up from the collar of her gown. 3 ribs felt like splintered glass every time she breathed. The shave patch over her right ear was still angry pink, where surgeons had slipped in to relieve pressure from the concussion. She looked breakable, which, for Riley, was just another form of camouflage. When no one was watching, her thumb traced the small, worn tattoo on her wrist. A minimalist trident, no bigger than a bottle cap. Navy regulations didn't exactly encourage visible ink, but she'd gotten it anyway the day after she'd made it through selection. Small enough to hide under a watch, permanent enough to remind her who she was when everything else got stripped away. The 3 men behind her hadn't seen it. They were Navy, all 3, bigger than her by at least 70 pounds apiece, moving with the loose confidence of men who'd never had a reason to doubt they were the toughest ones in the room. The tallest, broad shoulders, high and tight cut, the kind of jaw people called commanding, until they saw what lived behind the eyes, kept glancing up and down the hallway, checking the angles. The stocky one with the sleeve tattoo flexed his hands like he was trying to get the blood flowing before a workout. The youngest, still soft around the face, walked because the other 2 were walking, jaw set like someone who'd made a bad choice and didn't know how to unmake it. A quick note before we go any further. Stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're reminders about who gets underestimated and what happens next. If that's the kind of thing you care about, you know what to do with the subscribe button. Riley turned the corner toward the supply closet at the far end, counting tiles, not steps. 12 feet to the wall. 8 feet of hallway width. Fire extinguisher to the right. Crash cart alcove behind her. Camera dome above, front quarter of the ceiling. Angles, obstacles cover. Her brain did the math on autopilot. It had been doing that kind of math since she was 19 and in a place that smelled like burned rubber and blood instead of hand soap. The 3 men spread out without even talking about it. One went wide to block the way back to the ward. One drifted left to cut her off from the nurse's station. The tall one kept the middle. Textbook. Sloppy textbook, but textbook. Riley lifted her head for the first time since she'd stepped into the corridor and met their eyes. Whatever they'd expected to see in her face, it wasn't what they found. There was no panic there, no confusion, no pleading, just a very calm, very tired woman who had already accepted that if this was going to happen, it was going to be quick. 2 years earlier, in a different corridor half a world away, Riley's world had gone sideways in a way that never truly righted itself. 9 months into her second tour with SEAL Team 5, she'd been the medic on a joint operation in the outskirts of Mosul. The team was supposed to hit a small compound, grab a facilitator, and be gone before anyone knew they were there. Instead, the courtyard gate blew inward on a pressure plate, shrapnel and dust shredding the night. The team took casualties. The world narrowed to headlamp beams and shouting over the radio. Half the group pulled back, dragging one wounded man between them. Riley ended up inside, alone with another operator who'd taken a round through the thigh, pinned in a half-collapsed hallway while enemy fighters scrambled in the dark. The radio crackled in her ear. "We're cut off. 30 mics for QRF. Can you hold?" Her reply had been simple. No choice. She turned a broken door into a barricade, applied a tourniquet by touch while rounds smacked the walls inches from her face, stitched gauze under fire, fired controlled bursts down a smoke-filled corridor to keep silhouettes from getting close enough to throw grenades. 27 minutes. That's what the after-action report said. 27 minutes of trading rounds with men who wanted very badly to walk over her body. Backup had found her on her knees, still in position, one hand on her teammate's carotid, rifle slack against her chest, throat raw from shouting into the radio. The insurgents she hadn't killed had been forced back by her refusal to let them reach their wounded prize. There were commendations later. Citations. A Navy Commendation Medal with a tiny bronze V pinned to her chest in a quiet ceremony that lasted 7 minutes and somehow felt longer than the firefight. But commendations didn't follow you down hospital corridors. The only thing that came with you everywhere was the weight of the memories. The tall one stepped ahead of the other two and planted himself in front of Riley, blocking her way. His name was Chief Petty Officer Mark Laird, 32, surface warfare guy. Never been further inland than a port call on his best day. The kind of sailor who'd grown up on sea stories about real men and never quite adjusted to the idea that the Navy's toughest operators weren't all built like recruiting posters. His dad had been a Vietnam-era bosun's mate who called women on warships a failed social experiment until the day he died. Laird had swallowed that attitude whole long before he ever put on his own uniform. He'd spent the afternoon in the base bar, chewing over a rumor he'd heard in the smoke pit, that the girl with the limp in ortho had been some kind of special warfare diversity project, a political checkbox in a community that didn't need any. The rumor was wrong, but he believed it, and belief was enough to make him dangerous. To Laird's left, Petty Officer Second Class Brandon Klein shifted his weight, tattooed forearms flexing. Klein was a bosun's mate too, stronger than he was smart, the kind of guy who considered bruises on other people proof of his own relevance. The youngest, Seaman Alex Rojas, was 19 and still had that slightly stunned look. All brand new sailors got when they realized the brochures had not quite matched reality. He'd been about to turn down Laird's invitation to take a walk until Klein clapped a hand on his shoulder and called him kid in a way that made backing out feel like cowardice, not common sense. So now he was here, heartbeat thudding in his ears, knowing this was wrong and not knowing how to get out without paying for it forever. Laird's lip curled. "You're a long way from the family wing, sweetheart." Riley stopped, close enough to touch, far enough to move. "This is my ward," she said, voice level. "Just heading back to my room." "Funny," Klein said. "Figured this floor was for people who've actually done something." Rojas stared at the floor. The corridor felt narrower all of a sudden. Riley's gaze flicked past them, measuring. Nurse's station, line of sight blocked. No visitors. No random foot traffic. Camera above. Right without headings. She looked like someone life had already beaten. Too thin under the hospital gown, walking with that careful half-shuffle of the recently broken. One arm strapped to her chest in a sling, hair scraped back to expose a swollen temple gone purple and yellow. Her hospital socks whispered over the floor as she made her way down the long, empty hallway of Naval Medical Center San Diego. Behind her, 3 men paced at an unhurried distance, like they were escorting her. They weren't. To them, she was just some damaged girl with a pity medal and a bed on a ward she didn't deserve. To them, she was the kind of problem you could fix with a little attitude adjustment. What they didn't see was the tiny trident tattooed on the inside of her left wrist, faded to bluish gray and mostly hidden under gauze and medical tape. What they didn't know was that 2 years earlier, in a house that smelled like cordite and burning plaster on the outskirts of Mosul, that same weak-looking girl had held a butchered hallway alone with a half-conscious teammate behind her and 8 gunmen in front of her. And what they could not possibly understand yet was that if there was one thing Petty Officer First Class Riley Shaw had learned in a decade of war, it was this. People who underestimated you were a tactical gift. It was a little past 2100. Night shift quiet. That particular hospital silence, made of beeping monitors, distant wheels, and muffled pain. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bathing everything in a pale, sick-light wash that made even healthy people look unwell. The orthopedics wing stretched empty in both directions. The nurses' station sat around the corner behind a partial wall. The visitors had been cleared out an hour ago. The cameras in the ceiling domes caught everyone and said nothing. Riley moved slowly because if she didn't, the right side of her chest lit up like broken glass. 3 cracked ribs. 1 fractured clavicle. A concussion bad enough that they'd shave a neat square above her ear to monitor swelling. Her right knee lived in a rigid brace that clicked when she turned too quickly. 5'5", maybe 130 pounds with the brace and hardware. Pale from blood loss and hospital lighting. A mess of bruises blooming up from under her gown like spilled ink. She did not look dangerous, which was very much the point. Her thumb brushed the ink on her wrist without thinking. The little trident was barely visible unless you knew what you were looking at. She'd gotten it the week she pinned on her seal insignia. Nothing big or dramatic, just a private reminder in a place her watch normally covered. A promise to herself in ink. The 3 men tailing her had watched her all day from across the physical therapy gym. They'd seen the sling, the limp, the nurse steadying her on the parallel bars. They'd seen her pause to breathe against the wall when the pain flared. They hadn't seen that quiet, measuring look in her eyes. The tall one in front, Chief Petty Officer Mark Laird, came from a line of Old Navy bosun's mates who thought the world had gone wrong the minute women started standing watches anywhere but shore commands. His father still called integrated crews social engineering over holiday dinners. Laird had absorbed those opinions along with his table manners. He'd been at the base bar for most of the afternoon, working his way through cheap whiskey and uglier stories. Someone mentioned the girl in ortho who'd come in on a medevac flight, and the word SEAL had been tossed around with a shrug and a smirk. Public affairs experiment, someone else called her. Box check. Nobody at that table had any actual facts. Laird didn't need them. To his left walked Petty Officer Second Class Brandon Klein. Klein had the solid build and permanently half-amused smile of someone who'd never been pushed to his limits and assumed that meant he didn't have any. He'd washed out of a special warfare screening 2 years earlier and blamed it on the Navy changing the game instead of his own performance. The youngest, Seaman Alex Rojas, should have been in his rack by then. 19, barely a year in uniform, still carrying the wide-eyed look of someone who hadn't figured out how to fit inside his own life yet. When Laird and Klein told him to come for a walk, he'd hesitated for exactly 1 heartbeat too long. After that, saying no would have been a bigger fight than going along. Riley turned down the side hall toward the storage closet. She'd counted the tiles on her first day. 8 feet between walls, 16 paces from corner to supply door, 31 to the crash cart alcove. Fire extinguisher halfway down on the right. Camera near the ceiling junction. No cover except the people you put on the floor. Before we go any farther, a quick word from outside the story. This is the kind of thing that doesn't show up in recruiting commercials. It's also the kind of thing that says everything about who actually wears the uniform. If stories like this mean something to you, if they make you angry or proud or both, go ahead and hit subscribe wherever you're listening or reading. These are the ones people try to bury. Riley stopped when Laird stepped in her path. He planted himself in the middle of the hallway, hands loose at his sides, shoulders relaxed, like there was any world in which this was a casual conversation. "You're off the beaten path, sweetheart," he said. His words were smooth, his eyes weren't. "This wing's for operational personnel." She met his gaze. "So is my room." Klein laughed, low and ugly. "No offense, ma'am, but rehab's for people who carried their own weight, not for PR stunts." Rojas shifted against the wall, throat working. He didn't say anything. Riley watched him out of the corner of her eye. Weight on the balls of his feet, not the heels. Hands open, not fists. He wanted to be anywhere else. That made him the least dangerous and, somehow, the most sad. "I'm going back to bed," she said. Her voice was calm enough to soundboard. "You gonna let me by?" Laird's smile thinned. "See, that's the thing. Been watching you all day, limping around like you own the place. Nurses fluttering, officers dropping by. And the story is you're some kind of, what, special warfare hero." His tone made it clear exactly how much he believed that. "Some of us still think you should have to earn that." Klein stepped a little closer, cutting off the angle toward the nurse's station. Rojas filled the space on the other side because that's what you do when the senior guys move and you don't know how not to. The box closed. Riley's ribs ached. Her head throbbed. The corridor seemed to tilt a little as the concussion made itself known. She inhaled slowly, counting. For seconds in. Hold. For seconds out. She'd been inside much worse traps with much worse men. Her vision blurred just for a heartbeat, and she was somewhere else entirely. The memory came like a flashbang. Different hallway. Different country. The smell of dust and copper and burned insulation instead of antiseptic. Walls half collapsed from the blast that tore through the entryway. Her teammate Ortiz on the floor behind her, like a mess of blood and shredded fabric, breath harsh and wet. Arabic voices outside the doorway, arguing over who would rush in first. A rifle round had punched into the wall inches from her ear, spraying plaster across her cheek. Her ears still rang from the initial explosion. Her hands had never trembled. Her world had narrowed to three things: the tourniquet biting into Ortiz's thigh, the weight of her rifle in her hands, and the black rectangle of the doorway where shapes kept trying to appear. 8 fighters, 2 magazines, a radio that crackled in and out as if it were a living thing deciding whether to help. You don't think about courage in moments like that. You think about angles, about conserving ammo, about making the guy in the doorway fall before he makes you fall. She'd killed time with numbers, counting breaths, counting heartbeats, counting how long she could keep a man from dying without evacuating him. Moving from kneeling to prone to avoid the rounds that chewed the doorframe where her head had just been. 20 minutes, the QRF had told her. She'd bought them 27. Now, back in the hospital corridor, with 3 American sailors blocking her way, the same cold, shrinking clarity settled over her. Her injury screamed. Her body cared. Her training did not. She moved first. Laird reached for the sling on her arm. He wasn't trying to shove her gently, and she knew it. The hand coming was wrong. Fingers spread, thumb high, center line open. He thought she couldn't do much with one good arm and a limp. She pivoted on her braced knee, stepping just out of his reach, letting his momentum carry his torso toward her. Her left palm snapped up in a short, vicious arc, smashing into the cartilage of his nose. The strike came from her legs, not her arm. Pain tore down her ribs like fire. She ignored it. Something inside his face crunched. His head rocked back, eyes going wide, hands shooting up instinctively. Blood burst down over his lips and chin. Klein lunged in from her right, faster than she'd hoped he could be, reaching for her hospital gown, probably intending to slam her into the wall. She seized his wrist with her left hand, stepped in under his arm, and rotated her body hard, wrenching the joint against its normal range of motion. The motion pulled at the fractures in her chest. Spots danced at the edge of her vision. He didn't manage a full scream, more of a choked grunt as his elbow lit up with bright, white pain and his knees buckled. She drove the point of her shoulder into his sternum on the way past, knocking the air out of him. Rojas froze. That hesitation lasted maybe 2 seconds. Enough time for his brain to finally catch up with what his body was doing here. Enough time to see his seniors as they were, 2 bigger, older men who just tried to jump an injured patient and gotten hurt for their trouble. "Stop," he blurted, too late and too soft for it to matter. Laird stumbled, swore through bloody teeth, and swung a wild, open-handed strike at Riley's face. She didn't bother to block. She wasn't going to absorb that with cracked ribs. She stepped back instead, let his hand catch her shoulder and spin her slightly, used the turn to drive the heel of her foot into his instep. The crunch beneath her sock was ugly and satisfying. His howl turned the corner from controlled aggression to real pain. Rojas reacted this time, surging forward and wrapping his arms around her from behind in a clumsy bear hug. The pressure crushed her ribs. The world went gray for a heartbeat. For a second, she hung there in his grip, unable to draw a full breath, body screaming to shut down. "You can quit," a treacherous little voice suggested. "Just go limp. Let them do what they're going to do. Deal with the rest later." She killed that thought like any other threat. Riley snapped her head back hard. The back of her skull crashed into Rojas's nose with a crack that she felt all the way down her spine. His arms recoiled instantly. Warm wetness sprayed her neck as blood began streaming down his face. Before he could double over, she drove her heel straight back, targeting by feel. Even half-dazed, even in hospital socks, the shot to his groin landed. He folded, hands dropping between his legs automatically, the air leaving his lungs in a harsh, high-pitched wheeze. Klein, half on his knees and clutching his arm, tried one last grab for her ankle. She shifted her weight and stamped down on his hand, grinding knuckles into tile. His shout bounced off the cinder block. From the first palm strike to the last stomp, the whole thing took less than 15 seconds. Then there was just breathing. Riley's came in ragged pulls that made her want to curl around her ribs and stay that way forever. Her foresight had torn open, blood dripping down her hand in a thin red line. The shoulder seam of her gown had ripped, exposing white dressing and angry stitches. She could feel a warm trickle along her cheek where one of the staples near her temple had given up. Laird staggered backward until his spine hit the wall, one hand over his ruined nose, the other cradling his foot. Klein knelt on all fours, cradling his elbow, eyes glassy with shock. Rojas lay on his side, knees drawn up, blood from his nose pooling under his cheek, quiet whimpers leaking out between his teeth. For 3 long heartbeats, nobody moved. Then, down the corridor, a door opened. Someone shouted. The distant buzz of an alarm tripped at the nurse's station. The cameras that had watched everything finally made their existence known. The first 2 Shore Patrol MPs arrived at a jog, slowed to a stunned walk at the site, and then sped up again, radios already at their mouths. Behind them, a nurse in blue scrubs took one look at the scene and disappeared back around the corner, undoubtedly yelling for more help. "Ma'am, don't move," one MP said automatically as he took in the blood, the torn gown, the 3 men on the ground. Riley stared at him, tempted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Moving was not high on her list of options anyway. Her legs wobbled. She locked her knees on pure stubbornness. She'd be damned if she collapsed with Laird still conscious enough to see it. "Are you injured?" the other MP asked. "Already was," she said. Her voice sounded flatter to her own ears than she'd intended. They just didn't improve the situation. Within minutes, the hallway filled with bodies. More MPs. A lieutenant from security. 2 more nurses wheeling a gurney. A duty doctor in a wrinkled white coat and coffee on his breath. Everyone talking at once in hushed urgency. The security team separated them out the way they would at any bar fight. Victims here, aggressors there. The problem was nobody could tell which was which based on appearance alone. That changed when Commander Eric Dalton, the hospital's duty officer for the night, stepped onto the scene. 16 years in uniform, most of it with Marines and sailors on the wrong side of bad luck. He'd done trauma rotations in Kandahar and Bahrain. He'd seen knife fights, domestic disputes, more drunken brawls than he could count. But he paused at the threshold now anyway. 3 male sailors, all larger, all battered. 1 woman in a torn gown, barely staying upright, blood on her face and hand, eyes disturbingly clear. "What happened?" he asked. Riley's answer was simple. "They blocked me in the hall and put hands on me. I defended myself." Dalton looked at Laird. "Chief." Laird's bravado had leaked out with the blood. Even through the swelling, regret crept into his features. He didn't answer. Klein stared at the floor. Rojas couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Dalton's gaze dropped to the chart clipped to the end of Riley's sling. "Name, rank, unit." He blinked once. "Petty Officer First Class Riley Shaw," he read aloud. "Naval Special Warfare Group. Your special operations." "Yes, sir." His eyes flicked to the tiny, faded ink on her wrist, to the shaved patch on her scalp, to the livid bruise along her ribs. He knew what those meant. He also knew the hospital cameras fed live into security's monitors. "Give me the footage," he told one of the MPs. His voice had gone very flat. The video came up on a tablet within minutes. They all watched it. No sound, just ghosts in grainy black and white. 3 men closing on a smaller figure. One reaching out. The explosion of violence that followed. It left very little room for narrative spin. 20 minutes later, Captain Harlan Reese, the base's deputy commander, arrived in jeans and a rumpled sweatshirt, hair still damp from a shower at home. Someone had dragged him out of bed with the headline, "3 sailors down, 1 patient responsible." He watched the footage twice without speaking. Then he looked at the 3 men again in person, then back at Riley. "Petty Officer Shaw," he said, "what's your current assignment?" "SEAL Team 5, sir. Temporarily med-boarded here after a training accident." He knew what that meant, too. People didn't usually end up with that many injuries from training unless it involved things that exploded or fell from great heights. Reese turned back to Laird, voice still maddeningly calm. "Chief, do you understand that you just assaulted a wounded special warfare operator on hospital grounds? While on duty, in uniform?" Laird swallowed. "Sir, we were just—" "There is no just here," Reese cut in. "I've seen the footage. Unless the video suddenly starts lying, this looks a lot less like just and a lot more like Article 128 assault." Klein flinched at the word article. Rojas wiped blood from his lip with the back of his hand, fingers shaking. Reese went on, each word dropping like a weight. "You 3 decided you knew who she was and what she deserved based on what she looked like and whatever garbage rumors you traded over drinks. You were wrong, and now you're going to live with that." He looked back at Riley. "Do you need immediate medical attention, petty officer?" "My IV's blown, sir. Ribs don't feel great, but they didn't before either. I'll live." He studied her for a long second, then did something that made the entire hallway go quiet. He came to attention and saluted. There she was in a ripped gown and hospital socks, hair messy, blood on her cheek, swaying a little on her feet. She raised her left hand, her only useful one, and returned it. The movement hurt more than she'd ever admit. Her fingers didn't even tremble. After that, things moved the way they always move when the military decides to take something seriously. Slowly in paperwork, quickly in consequence. The formal investigation took 9 days. The security footage told most of the story. The rest came out under questioning and in written statements. How Laird had been complaining about lowered standards for months. How Klein had called the medevac flights Uber for people who couldn't hack it. How Rojas had told a friend, quietly, that he'd messed up bad and didn't know how to fix it. Riley's own statement was maddeningly simple. She didn't editorialize. She didn't speculate about motives. She wrote, in clinical sentences, that they had blocked her exit and initiated contact, and she had responded with appropriate force to remove the threat. What she did add, in a single line near the end, was this: "Seaman Rojas appeared reluctant and did not strike me directly. I believe he followed the others out of misplaced loyalty, not malice." The judge advocate who drew the case added Article 134, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, to the Article 128 assault charges. Command wanted to send a message, and 3 battered men in casts and slings made for a memorable poster. Laird and Klein both stood courts-martial. They lost rank, careers, and freedom. Each got several months in confinement and bad conduct discharges that would shadow them every time they filled out a form for the rest of their lives. Rojas went to an administrative hearing instead. Reduction in rank. 60 days restriction. A permanent black mark on his record. He would not be promoted again in any meaningful way. But he kept his uniform. When someone asked Riley, afterward, why she'd argued for leniency for him in her private memo to the captain, she'd shrugged. He hesitated, she'd said. If the world punished hesitation and regret as hard as intent, none of U.S. would make it out of our 20s. Word of what happened spread through the hospital faster than any official memo could have. Rumors grew, shrank, mutated, as they always do. In some versions, she'd fought off 6 men. In others, she'd done it with one arm fully immobilized and a dislocated jaw. The details were wrong. The core was not. 3 men cornered a female patient. She put them down. She was, in fact, the thing they said she didn't deserve to be. For the rest of her stay, the energy around Riley changed. Young sailors and Marines, especially women, started pausing at her door. Some just looked in, confirming the legend belonged to an actual person. Others came in and sat down, hands knotted in their lap, asking half-formed questions. How'd you make it through selection when everyone said you couldn't? What did you do when the guys didn't trust you on deployment? How do you know you're good enough to be there? She didn't give speeches. She answered practically. You outwork them. You outperform them. You let your results argue for you. You learn to tell the difference between fair hard and pointless hard. You lean on the people who see you clearly. You accept that some people will never change, and you don't let them rent space in your head for free. She talked rarely about Mosul. She talked more about the everyday grind, the cold water, the sand and everything, the hours and hours of being evaluated for a mistake you might make tomorrow. If anyone noticed that her hands sometimes stilled mid-sentence and her eyes went far away, they were polite enough not to mention it. On her last morning at the hospital, paperwork signed and discharge orders in hand, Riley walked that hallway again. The walls had been repainted. The scuffs and faint brown smears on the floor were gone. The camera dome stared down with blank disinterest. If you didn't know, you'd never guess what had happened there. She knew. She stopped under the camera and flexed her fingers around the strap of her duffel. 3 men had walked into this space absolutely certain of who she was, a weak link, a fraud, an easy target. They walked out on stretchers, careers shattered, their certainty broken along with their bones. That wasn't the part that stayed with her. What stayed was this. Somewhere down the line, some other woman would walk into a room in uniform, and there'd be one less man in that audience ready to write her off on sight. Or at least one more who thought twice about acting on that impulse. It wasn't justice. It was something smaller and more human than that. But it was something. She exhaled carefully. Her ribs still ached when she breathed too deep and headed for the exit. Outside, the sky over San Diego was just starting to lighten with the first hint of dawn. The air tasted like salt and jet fuel and possibility. She had a medical bore to face, a career to salvage or reshape, a phone call waiting from a training command in Coronado that wanted to talk about using her experience to help the next wave of female candidates coming up behind her. And she had ghosts. They'd ride with her wherever she went. They always did. If you've made it this far, you already know why stories like Riley's matter. Not because she's some superhero in a hospital gown, but because every person who ever got written off on sight carries some version of this inside them. If that hits home, if you've ever been on either side of that mistake, don't just scroll on. Share this. Save it. Subscribe. Make sure the next person who needs this story actually finds it.